The sun rose over Tarawa on November 20th, 1943, painting the Pacific in blood-orange light. Out beyond the reefs, the horizon boiled with the silhouettes of American warships, an armada unlike anything the Japanese garrison had ever seen. To the defenders of Betio Island, it was arrogance made manifest. They had spent nearly a year fortifying this speck of coral, turning it into a fortress of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries. Every inch of sand had been mapped, mined, and zeroed in for pre-registered fire. And most importantly, a coral reef, nearly 500 yards wide, encircled the island like a natural wall. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, looked out from his bunker and told his men, "1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years." He wasn't boasting out of madness. The geography favored him. The reef was too shallow for landing craft, too jagged for tanks, and too far from shore for swimmers burdened with gear. The Japanese believed it made Betio invincible. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that the Americans had brought something entirely new to war: machines that could swim. Far out at sea, aboard U.S. Navy transport ships, the decks groaned under the weight of strange boxy vehicles with tracks instead of wheels. Painted olive drab and shaped like floating tanks, they looked clumsy, half boat, half bulldozer. But to the men of the 2nd Marine Division, they were lifelines. They called them LVTs, Landing Vehicle Tracked, and affectionately nicknamed them Amtraks. Each could carry 20 fully armed Marines or several tons of supplies straight from ship to shore. No ramps, no piers, no waiting for high tide. For the first time in history, armor and infantry could ride the waves together. As dawn broke, naval guns thundered. Battleships Nevada and Maryland unleashed a storm of fire, their 14-inch shells ripping apart the island's palm groves. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil, but the Japanese held firm, deep in concrete bunkers that even the heaviest shells couldn't crush. Then came the signal, green flares from the flagship USS Maryland. Over 100 LVTs rumbled down the ramps into the surf. Engines roared, tracks churned white foam, and one by one, the Amtraks crawled into the Pacific. Inside each, Marines sat shoulder to shoulder, faces streaked with sweat and salt. Some crossed themselves, others clenched their rifles so tight their knuckles turned white. The water slapped against the metal hulls as the machines clawed forward, their engines groaning under the strain. Ahead lay the smoke-shrouded outline of Betio, flat, barren, and deadly. Halfway to shore, the Japanese opened fire. Machine gun tracers stitched across the waves. Mortar shells burst around the formation, showering the water with shrapnel. Some LVTs vanished in fireballs, others sank slowly, riddled with holes. But the survivors kept moving. Their tracks bit into the reef, crawling over the coral like prehistoric beasts. The waves that had been meant to drown them became their pathway. On the bridge of the USS Zealand, a Navy officer watching through binoculars muttered, "My God, they're going right over the reef!" It was true. The impossible barrier had been breached. The first wave hit the beach and chaos erupted. Marines jumped from their LVTs into waist-deep water, charging through barbed wire and wreckage. Some were cut down instantly. Others reached the seawall, pressed flat against it as Japanese guns tore the air apart. But for every LVT destroyed, 2 more arrived, spilling men, ammo, and flamethrowers onto the sand. By noon, Betio's beaches were littered with burning hulks and bodies, but the foothold was secure. What naval artillery couldn't do from miles away, the LVTs had done at point-blank range. They had carried the fight across the sea and onto the enemy's doorstep. Rear Admiral Shibasaki's prophecy died that day. The Marines had taken Tarawa not in 100 years, but in 76 hours. The cost was horrific, over 1,000 Americans killed, 2,000 wounded, but the lesson was eternal. The sea was no longer a wall, it was a road. As night fell, a lone LVT, its hull scarred, its engine coughing smoke, crept back toward the reef to rescue stranded Marines. A sergeant on board looked back at the burning island and whispered, "They said we couldn't cross the ocean. We didn't cross it, we brought it with us." In that moment, under the red glow of Tarawa's horizon, A new kind of warfare was born. The amphibious tank had proven itself not in theory, but in blood. The Japanese had built their defenses on the assumption that the sea would protect them. The Americans had turned that sea into their greatest weapon. And though neither side could yet know it, the same machines that crawled over the coral that morning would within 2 years carry the war all the way to Okinawa and to the edge of Japan.
Before the roar of naval guns and the blood-red waves of Tarawa, there was a man in Florida tinkering with what he thought was a rescue vehicle. His name was Donald Roebling, grandson of the engineer who built the Brooklyn Bridge. In 1935, after witnessing the devastation of hurricanes that left people stranded in swamps and mangrove marshes, Roebling began designing a tracked amphibious vehicle that could rescue storm victims where no boat or truck could go. His invention was called the Alligator, a squat, clunky machine with riveted aluminum plates, paddle-like tracks, and an engine that could churn through mud and water alike. It looked absurd, but it worked. In tests, it swam across canals, climbed onto land, and slogged through thick Florida muck without getting stuck. Newspapers called it the machine that walks on water. At first, the U.S. military wasn't interested. It seemed like a novelty, something for civilian rescue, not war. But when World War II loomed and American planners began to imagine the Pacific's island fortresses, the concept took on a new meaning. The Navy and Marine Corps needed something that could do what no ship or plane could: cross the last 500 yards, that deadly strip of beach where every invasion risked disaster. They needed a vehicle that could bridge the gap between sea and land, immune to reefs, tides, and machine gun fire. In 1940, the Marines sent officers to Roebling's home in Clearwater to watch a demonstration. The Alligator clanked into a canal, floated across, climbed a bank, and kept going. The spectators stared in silence. Colonel John Kaloof of the U.S. Marine Corps finally turned to Roebling and said, "Mr. Roebling, that's exactly what we've been looking for, only make it out of steel." Thus began one of the most unlikely military transformations in history. A rescue craft became a weapon of war. Roebling's workshop turned into a production line, and soon the first military prototypes were being tested at Marine Corps Base Quantico. The Navy designated it LVT-1, Landing Vehicle Tracked. It could carry 20 Marines or 2 tons of cargo, powered by a 146-horsepower Hercules engine. It was unarmored, open-topped, and underpowered, but it could swim, and that made it priceless. The early versions were fragile. In training, their aluminum hulls cracked in rough surf, and engines flooded with salt water. Marines joked that LVT stood for "Let's Volunteer to Try." But behind the humor was respect. Nothing else could take them from ship to shore without getting stuck on reefs or drowning in breakers. As the Pacific War intensified, the engineers kept improving. The LVT-2 Water Buffalo replaced the fragile aluminum with heavy steel and doubled its horsepower. The LVT-4 added a rear ramp for faster unloading, turning it into the first true amphibious assault vehicle. Then came the LVT-A1, fitted with a turret-mounted 37mm cannon, the world's first amphibious tank. Later, the LVT-A4 carried a 75mm howitzer, transforming from transport to floating artillery. While the designs evolved, the doctrine around them did too. The U.S. Marine Corps, guided by forward-thinking officers like Major General Holland Mad Smith, realized that the Pacific Theater was not just a naval war, it was an amphibious one. The Marines would need to storm dozens of islands, each defended by dug-in Japanese troops. Tanks couldn't swim, and boats couldn't fight, but an LVT could do both. In early 1942, the first LVTs entered combat in the Guadalcanal campaign, hauling supplies and wounded men through jungle rivers. They proved invaluable, but still flawed, slow, thin-skinned, and vulnerable to enemy fire. Mechanics learned to patch bullet holes with tin and weld extra plates scavenged from wrecks. Pilots of the machines, called Amtrak crews, became specialists in amphibious warfare, half sailor, half soldier. By 1943, the factories of Food Machinery Corporation, FMC, in California and Pennsylvania were producing hundreds every month. The American war machine had embraced Roebling's idea completely. The same industrial power that built bombers and tanks was now churning out the ungainly, indispensable LVTs that would carry Marines onto every hostile shore. But for all their innovation, few in Washington understood what the LVTs would truly face when they reached Tarawa. There, they would be put to the ultimate test, against coral reefs, entrenched Japanese defenses, and the unforgiving Pacific itself. The irony was not lost on those who knew Roebling personally. His alligator had been meant to save lives, to reach the stranded and helpless. Now its descendants would crawl through machine gun fire to deliver men into the jaws of war. In a letter written to his wife before the Tarawa invasion, one Marine sergeant put it simply, "They say these things can swim and fight. If that's true, then maybe they'll get us there. And if they get us there, we'll do the rest." When the engines of the first LVTs revved up before dawn on November 20th, 1943, no one knew whether they would make it to shore. But what began as a humanitarian experiment was about to redraw the map of modern warfare. And as the sun rose over Betio, those machines, born in peace, baptized in war, would prove that the line between land and sea no longer existed.
The morning of November 20th, 1943, began with an illusion of control. From the bridge of the battleship Maryland, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner watched as naval guns pounded Beteo Island into dust. For 3 hours, every warship in Task Force 53 unleashed a storm unlike anything the Pacific had seen. The sea shook under the concussion of 16-inch shells. Observation officers reported nothing left alive on Tarawa. It looked perfect, mathematically, industrially, inevitably American. But on the island, deep in reinforced concrete bunkers, the Japanese were very much alive. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki's garrison, 4,800 men of the elite 3rd Special Base Defense Force, had spent nearly a year turning Beteo into a death trap. They had 500 machine guns, 40 artillery pieces, and interlocking fields of fire that covered every yard of sand. The bombing had shattered palm trees and shredded the beach, but the men inside the pillboxes waited calmly, faces wrapped in sweat-soaked towels, fingers resting on triggers. At 900 hours, the naval bombardment lifted. Silence fell. Brief, absolute. Then the whine of landing craft engines began to echo across the water. The first wave was coming. The sea was deceptive that morning. Tides around Tarawa were unpredictable, and the attack planners had relied on optimistic estimates. The landing craft, Higgins boats with flat bottoms, hit the reef 500 yards from shore and stopped dead. The water was only 3 feet deep, too shallow for the boats, but too deep for men carrying 80 pounds of gear. Hundreds of Marines were forced to jump overboard and wade across the open lagoon. Japanese machine guns opened up immediately. The air turned to metal. From the command ship, the view was horrifying. A carpet of men slogged forward through water dyed red with blood. For many, the last thing they saw were tracer rounds slicing the waves around them. But in the midst of that slaughter, something extraordinary was happening. The LVTs were still moving. Unlike the Higgins boats, the tracked amphibians didn't stop at the reef. They clawed over it, crawled through the shallows, and kept going. Each one carried 20 Marines huddled low inside the steel hull. Bullets ricocheted off their sides, punched holes through the thin armor, or found flesh inside, but the machines pressed forward. They looked like prehistoric monsters, one observer wrote, crawling straight out of the ocean into hell. LVT No. 9, commanded by Corporal Edward Lefrancois, was one of the first to reach the beach. As the ramp dropped, his squad leapt into a storm of fire. Half his men were hit before they cleared the vehicle. He turned the LVT around, intending to go back for more troops, and took 3 direct hits from a 13mm machine gun.
Somehow, he made it back to the reef. He would later receive the Silver Star. All along the shoreline, the LVTs were dying heroic deaths. Many burned where they landed, their gasoline tanks erupting in orange fireballs. Others became improvised cover, immobile hulks shielding Marines from the rain of bullets. Radio operators used them as signal points. Medics treated the wounded in their shadows. The price was horrific. Of the 125 LVTs that went ashore that morning, more than half were destroyed or disabled. Yet without them, the invasion would have failed. By noon, the Marines had established a shaky line behind a seawall of coconut logs. The first LVTs began ferrying ammunition and reinforcements, crawling through fire to deliver what the men on shore desperately needed: bullets, grenades, water. The Amtrak crews refused to stop. Some made 6 or 7 trips across the lagoon. One Marine later said, "If the LVT drivers hadn't kept coming, we'd all have died on that beach." The battle raged for 76 hours. Marines fought yard by yard, clearing pillboxes with flamethrowers and grenades. The LVTs that survived became mobile bunkers, blasting enemy positions at point-blank range. One LVT A-1, armed with a 37mm gun, silenced 3 Japanese strongpoints before being knocked out. Its crew fought on foot until they were overrun. By the 3rd day, the American flag flew over Bateo. Out of nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders, only 17 were taken alive. The rest had died where they stood, often by their own grenades. The Marines counted more than 1,000 of their own dead and twice that number wounded. It was one of the bloodiest single operations in Marine Corps history. But, for all its horror, Tarawa was a victory of transformation. It proved that amphibious warfare could succeed even against the strongest defenses on Earth. Every lesson learned about timing, tides, coordination, and the role of armored amphibians would shape every invasion that followed, from Saipan to Iwo Jima. When the reports reached Washington, some politicians demanded to know why so many had died for 1 square mile of sand. Admiral Chester Nimitz answered quietly, "We learned a lot at Tarawa. We'll never make the same mistakes again." He was right. In the following months, the Navy refined the use of LVTs, training drivers to form waves of mechanized assault that could carry troops, tanks, and supplies simultaneously. Engineers added armor plating, flamethrowers, and better guns. The next time the Japanese waited behind a reef, they would discover that the Americans had turned the lessons of Tarawa into science. On that tiny island, surrounded by wrecked machines and shattered coral, the Pacific War had changed forever. The Japanese believed nature itself, reefs, tides, distance, was their shield. The LVTs had turned it into a weapon. As one war correspondent wrote in his dispatch, "They said the sea would stop us. Instead, it delivered us." When the last LVT crawled back through the waves that night, its hull blackened and engine coughing, a Marine leaned over its side and whispered, "Tell Roebling his alligators made it."
In the months after Tarawa, the Pacific Ocean became an assembly line of invasion. What had been a desperate gamble on a single coral atoll now evolved into a precise and terrifying art. The lessons written in blood at Bateo were not forgotten. They were refined, mechanized, and multiplied. At the heart of this new doctrine were the machines that had made it all possible, the LVTs. By early 1944, the U.S. Navy's amphibious fleet stretched from Hawaii to the Solomons. Dozens of new LVT variants rolled off production lines every month. Engineers had learned from every hole, every jammed track, every burning hulk at Tarawa. The result was a new generation of war machines, faster, deadlier, and more resilient. The LVT-4, with its rear ramp, could unload troops in seconds instead of minutes. The LVT-A4, fitted with a turreted 75mm howitzer, could blast pillboxes straight from the water. They were no longer just transports. They were the first amphibious tanks in history. In June 1944, the Marines put them to the ultimate test: Saipan. The invasion fleet that gathered in the Marianas was the largest the Pacific had seen, over 500 ships carrying 127,000 men. As dawn broke on June 15th, the sea itself seemed to move. Hundreds of LVTs crawled through the surf, their engines rumbling like an iron tide. Behind them came waves of landing craft, tanks, and artillery. Above them, carrier planes roared overhead, strafing the beaches. The Japanese defenders, 30,000 strong, opened fire with everything they had. Mortars whistled. 47mm anti-tank guns spat fire. But this time, the American assault didn't stall at the reef. The LVTs glided right over it, advancing through explosions and smoke. It was like watching the sea come alive. The whole ocean turned to armor, one sailor recalled. The Marines rode into hell and kept going. The first waves smashed into the beach, dropped their ramps, and poured men into the firestorm. Some LVTs were hit, their engines bursting into flames. Others lost tracks, bogged down in sand and surf, but most pressed inland, firing their 37mm and 75mm guns as they went. They flattened trenches, shredded machine gun nests, and even dueled Japanese light tanks at point-blank range. A few days later, on neighboring Tinian, the assault was even more refined. The beaches were narrow, the coral jagged, and the defenders ready. But the Americans had learned their craft. LVTs carried not only infantry, but bulldozers, ammunition, and even small tanks. They advanced in perfectly timed waves, coordinated by radio with offshore ships. For the first time in history, an amphibious invasion unfolded with mechanical precision. Everywhere the LVTs went, the Japanese defensive doctrine collapsed. For years, imperial planners had assumed reefs and tides were their greatest allies. They had built bunkers to face the sea, believing any assault would founder before reaching the beach. But now the enemy came not to the reef, but over it. At Peleliu, the LVTs faced their worst nightmare: razor-sharp coral that tore their tracks to pieces, and Japanese artillery zeroed in to kill them mid-ocean. Crews fought with courage that bordered on madness, ferrying reinforcements through what veterans later called a cauldron of steel. The losses were staggering, but they never stopped coming. By the time of Okinawa in 1945, the last great amphibious invasion of the war, the system had reached perfection. Over 1,000 LVTs carried Marines and Army troops onto the island. The vehicles had improved armor, mounted flamethrowers, and worked in tandem with tanks and artillery. Naval observers called it the moving shoreline. From the air, it looked like a living organism, waves of steel crawling from sea to land, guided by unseen rhythms of strategy and logistics. The Japanese watched from the cliffs and bunkers in disbelief. Their officers had once mocked the Americans as island-hopping fools. Now they saw that those fools had built an army that could swim. The LVT A-4s blasted enemy bunkers with their 75mm guns, while the standard LVTs ferried wounded men back to hospital ships. Each invasion became a cycle. The same machines that carried the living to battle carried the dying away. Mechanics on the beach patched bullet holes with scrap metal, poured oil into smoking engines, and sent the vehicles back into the surf for another run. One Marine lieutenant later said, "The LVTs were like mules. They'd get hit, patched up, and sent back to the surf. We stopped thinking of them as machines. They were part of the team." At Okinawa, one Amtrak crew rescued over 40 wounded soldiers under direct artillery fire, making 9 trips between shore and ship. When their engine finally seized, they left it on the beach, a burned-out monument to endurance. Everywhere they fought, the LVTs redefined what amphibious warfare meant. They erased the boundary between Navy and Army, between sea and shore. Commanders no longer feared reefs or tides. The ocean was no longer an obstacle, it was a weapon. By the end of the Pacific Campaign, nearly 20,000 LVTs had been built in more than a dozen variants. They had fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, across every island chain between Hawaii and Japan. They had carried 500,000 men into combat, saved tens of thousands of wounded, and turned every beach into a bridgehead. But their greatest triumph was not mechanical, it was psychological. Every time those tracked monsters crawled out of the sea, the Japanese saw the impossible made real. The waves they had trusted became the enemy's road. At the war's end, a captured Japanese officer confessed to his interrogators, "We believed the ocean protected us, but the Americans, they came from the ocean itself. They made the sea their ally." He wasn't wrong. The sea had been conquered, not by fleets of battleships, but by a fleet of amphibious beasts that carried men through surf and fire, across coral and blood. And though the battles were far from over, the message was already clear. Japan's island empire had lost its walls. The very water that once surrounded it had turned against it.
When the smoke finally cleared from Okinawa and the Pacific fell silent in the summer of 1945, the world had changed. The Japanese Empire's once impenetrable island defenses lay shattered, and the blueprint of modern amphibious warfare had been drawn in the surf. The LVT, the ungainly alligator that began as a civilian rescue craft, had not just carried Marines across beaches, it had carried America across the Pacific. What began as an experiment had become a doctrine, a new way to wage war that erased the ancient line between land and sea. For the American High Command, the transformation was revolutionary. Before Tarawa, naval planners believed amphibious assaults were inherently suicidal. By the time of Okinawa, they had turned them into an exact science. Every invasion, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, followed a formula built around one idea: mechanized mobility from ship to shore. The LVT was the linchpin. It synchronized with naval gunfire, carrier airstrikes, and beachhead logistics to create a seamless multi-domain offensive that no coastal defense could withstand. The results spoke for themselves. Japan's garrisons, once confident in their coral and concrete, were annihilated one by one. The ocean, long thought their greatest shield, had become the road to their destruction. Even the Imperial General Staff, reviewing post-battle reports from the Marianas, admitted that no fortification can resist an enemy who can swim ashore with armor. The phrase became a grim epitaph for Japan's island strategy. Yet the LVT's story was more than military innovation. It was industrial triumph. In 1940, Donald Roebling had built one handcrafted prototype. By 1945, over 18,000 had rolled off American production lines in factories from Pennsylvania to California. Engineers refined every nut and rivet. Steel holes replaced aluminum. Self-sealing fuel tanks stopped fires. Armor shields protected crews from shrapnel. Each new variant embodied America's unmatched ability to adapt technology to battlefield need. Proof that victory was as much forged in workshops as in trenches. The LVT-A series, armed with 37mm and 75mm guns, blurred the line between transport and tank. They could provide direct fire support while still swimming through breakers. Later designs, like the LVT-A5, added powered turrets, gyroscopic sights, and heavier armor, turning the water buffalo into a true amphibious predator. By the final months of the war, LVTs were landing Sherman flamethrower tanks, half-tracks, and even field artillery, creating mechanized beachheads within minutes. Strategically, this changed everything. What the island campaign proved was not simply that the U.S. could capture islands, it proved that it could project mechanized power anywhere on Earth that the ocean touched. The sea was no longer a void separating continents. It was an extension of American logistics. Admiral Chester Nimitz
called it the continuum of the Pacific Highway. His staff planners referred to the process as rolling up the map, each new amphibious landing bringing airfields and harbors closer to Japan's home islands, each made possible by the crawling steel beasts of the amphibious fleet. But the cost had been immense. Thousands of Amtrak crewmen were killed or wounded, often burned alive in their open hulls. Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima became graveyards of twisted machines and melted steel. To those who rode them, the LVT was both savior and coffin. Many Marines carried a strange reverence for the vehicle that had delivered them through hell. One survivor of Saipan later wrote, "When you saw one coming through the smoke, you knew you had a chance to live. When you saw one burning, you knew someone had already paid for it." When the war ended, the LVT's legacy did not fade, it evolved. The Marines kept improving the design, birthing the LVT-P5, LVT-P7, and eventually the AAV-7A1, still in use decades later. Every modern amphibious assault vehicle owes its lineage to Roebling's Alligator and the lessons of the Central Pacific. In Korea, Incheon proved the concept again. Tides, reefs, and walls were no match for armored mobility. In Vietnam, the Amtrak became both troop transport and gun platform, crawling through mangroves just as its ancestors had through Tarawa's reefs. Even today, the echoes of that transformation remain. The U.S. Marine Corps continues to train around one sacred principle: from the sea to the shore and beyond. It is the same idea born in those blood-red waters of 1943 when American ingenuity turned a rescue machine into the key to victory. For Japan, the shock of the LVT was not merely tactical, it was existential. Their entire defensive doctrine had rested on geography, on the idea that the Pacific itself would protect them. But the Alligator proved that technology could erase oceans. A nation that once saw itself as invulnerable behind miles of open sea had to confront a grim truth: the modern world had no natural barriers. Historians would later call the LVT the machine that conquered distance. Strategists saw it differently. It was the first weapon to make the planet truly small. The coral reefs of Tarawa, the volcanic shores of Saipan, the cliffs of Okinawa, all had been undone by a vehicle built in a Florida garage by a man who only wanted to save lives. Donald Roebling never forgot that irony. When reporters asked him how he felt knowing his invention had killed so many, he paused before answering, "I built it to reach people in trouble." Maybe it still did. In the end, the LVT story is not just about machines or strategy or victory. It's about imagination, the ability to see beyond the horizon and make the impossible crossable. It was the moment when the sea stopped being a barrier and became a bridge, when engineering turned nature itself into a battlefield. And on that bridge of steel and salt water, carried by roaring engines and fearless men, an empire fell.